Chrysler's turning 100. 100 years of people-first innovations, from inventing the first plug-in hybrid minivan with stow-and-go seating to reimagining what's next with the Halcyon concept. Chrysler has always put people at the center. Here's to the last century of innovation and the next century to come.
Welcome to Daily Drive for Tuesday, June 3rd, 2025. I'm Jamie Butters, Executive Editor of Automotive News here in Detroit.
And I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. Today on the show, interest in EVs hits a 6-year low. May sales gains couldn't keep up with previous months. And Honda looks to lift its profile in the U.S. with Olympic sponsorships. Plus, Bob Lee, North American president of LG Energy Solution, talks about how the battery maker is reacting to tariffs and its strategy for electrification amid sluggish EV demand.
We're committed to building these products here in the U.S., but we do need some time to diversify away from some of those suppliers.
Let's run through all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry.
Interest in electric vehicles has sunk to its lowest level since 2019. That's according to a consumer survey commissioned by AAA. Only 16% of respondents reported being likely or very likely to purchase an electric vehicle as their next car. The percentage of customers who indicated they would be unlikely or very unlikely to purchase an EV as their next vehicle rose from 51% to 63%. That's the highest since 2022. 62% of respondents cited high battery repair costs as a main reason for not going fully electric. However, EV batteries may have longer lives than previously thought, according to a study from the SLAC Stanford Battery Center.
The rush to buy a new car or SUV and get ahead of price increases in the wake of U.S. tariffs continued in May, but at a slower pace than April and March. Several major automakers posted higher sales in May. Toyota reported an 11% rise in May U.S. sales. Its namesake brand posted a 12% gain. Lexus was up more than 2%. U.S. sales rose 16% at Ford last month, behind another month of employee pricing deals. The company reported a 25% rise in SUV and crossover sales and an 11% gain in pickup sales.
May sales rose 6.5% at Honda. The company says its passenger car deliveries totaled nearly 40,000 in May, a high for the year so far. Meanwhile, Honda's electrified vehicle sales set a new May record of more than 37,000. Volume rose nearly 8% at Hyundai last month and more than 5% at Kia. It was the 8th consecutive monthly gain for both brands, but those results fell short of the double-digit gains in March and April. As of recording time Tuesday, we're still waiting on U.S. results from Subaru, followed by Volvo on Wednesday. Most other automakers release U.S. sales on a quarterly basis, if at all. You can find all of the latest sales results and more details at autonews.com.
Toyota Group companies and Toyota Motor Chairman Akio Toyoda are officially making their move to buy out Toyota Industries, the company that kicked off the Toyota dynasty. Toyota Industries says it was offered 16,300 yen a share, or $134. That's about 12% below the day's closing price on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. A Toyota Motor spokesperson says the total deal is valued at almost $33 billion. The tender offer bid is planned for December, and it's not clear when it will be completed.
And Honda will be the official automotive sponsor of Team USA athletes for the Olympic and Paralympic Games, starting with the 2026 Winter Games in Italy. It will also be a founding partner of the 2028 Summer Games in Los Angeles. Timing of the Winter Games coincides with the launch of the first Honda-developed electric vehicle, the Acura RSX. It will go into production at the end of 2025 and launch in early 2026. Production models based on the Honda Zero Series SUV and Saloon will be introduced the same year. And those are today's headlines.
So, Jamie, interest in EVs have sunk to their lowest level since 2019. What do you think are the underlying reasons?
Well, Oh, look, I mean, President Trump and his allies, they're not big fans of EVs. They've been down talking them for quite a while. But I think a lot of this is a timing effect. This survey by AAA was taken in early March. We remember there was a huge surge in EV sales late December and in January as people who were interested in EVs were trying to get them while the IRA tax credits were in place before the inauguration and before any actions could happen against it. So at that time, who's left in the market, right? People who wanted EVs already got them. It's mostly left to people who weren't really interested in them. And that's kind of where it is. Be interesting to see how that goes from there. It's not a great environment for EVs these days.
Gotcha. Coming up, LG Energy Solution North America Chief Bob Lee talks about the changing landscape for the battery supplier. That's next on Daily Drive.
The 2025 Automotive Golf Classic is coming up soon, raising funds for the Boys and Girls Clubs of Southeastern Michigan. Players will tee off Monday, June 16th at St. John's Resort in Plymouth, Michigan.
Attendees will get exclusive access to the third annual Automotive News Supplier Panel discussion just prior to tee time at 9 a.m. This year's remarks will feature Paul Thomas, President of Bosch North America, along with Colin Shaw, President of MEMA Original Equipment Suppliers. The executive guests will discuss challenges for suppliers stemming from the current trade landscape, new U.S. tariffs, and other critical issues facing the supply chain.
For more information about this event, reach out to Tiffany Sula at the Boys and Girls Clubs at tsula@bgcsm.org or to Philip Nussel, AGC Executive Chairman at pnussel@crane.com.
Chrysler's turning 100. That's a whole century of shaping the way America drives and leading with innovation. Did you know Chrysler introduced the first ignition key? What about the first automatic transmission, the first Hemi V8 engine, the first windshield wipers, and the first ever minivan? And they never stopped innovating, even today. The Chrysler Pacifica is the first and only plug-in hybrid minivan, the first with the convenience of stow-and-go seating, and it's packed with the most high-tech safety features in its segment. But for Chrysler, it's about more than just innovating. It's about innovating for people, for memories, road trips with your friends, school drop-offs in the rain, family reunions, weekend soccer tournaments, first dates, first drives, and everything in between. Chrysler's been there for all of it, leading the way with game-changing ideas. And they've introduced the Halcyon concept, driving the brand's future innovation, focusing on building a sleek, smart, sustainable vehicle design for the next generation of driver. So here's to Chrysler, 100 years of innovation, memories, and everything in between.
Welcome back to Daily Drive. I'm Jamie Butters with Kellen Walker. Suppliers aren't having a good time in 2025 as the changing tariff landscape roils markets and makes it nearly impossible to plan. But one North American battery supplier executive says it's a double-edged sword for his company. Bob Lee is North American president of LG Energy Solution. He spoke with our own Hannah Lutz on Shift, a podcast about mobility.
How do the tariffs affect LG Energy's business, especially in North America?
Sure. So the tariffs are a pretty complex topic. So maybe I would take it in several different layers. First, the impact on the auto industry overall, maybe impact on the battery industry, which we're directly part of, and then finally our supply chain, right? Because we do import materials from outside. So in terms of the auto industry, there's a lot of concerns that tariffs would increase costs and therefore reduce overall demand. I think recently Ford and GM have announced, approximately $5 billion or 20% of the content needs to be imported. So I think from our customer value chain point of view, the concern is more along the lines of overall demand. And if the industry is shrinking, obviously, as a supplier into that industry, we would also, have to manage that reduction in volume. So I think overall auto industry, there's a lot of uncertainty. And as you know, there's, people trying to understand what the full impacts are. And I think that's still something that we're working through with our customers. But the overall demand shrinkage, I think, is the biggest topic there. If you look at the battery industry specifically and LG Energy Solution, I would say we are less directly impacted because we have 8 plants in North America. We have 7 plants in the U.S. So we've made a very strong commitment to produce here in the U.S. for the U.S. market. And from that point of view, I think we're well positioned. In fact, I would say in some cases, we really benefit because we're an early mover and we've made such investments. I think a lot of customers are interested in working with LG. Just to clarify the type of plants, while most of our plants are focused on pouch, NMC, automotive applications, we also have one plant that will be building cylindrical cells in Arizona. And we'll also be building LFP cells in Holland plant starting next month. So we're going to have not only a large footprint, but a footprint where we're producing multiple formats, multiple chemistries in the U.S. And I think that, for us is a capability that, makes us very resilient in the U.S. market. In fact, a lot of customers are actually coming to us. And from that point of view, it's been a real positive boon. The part that is the trickiest and the one that is most nuanced is probably the supply chain. So we are committed to trying to localize our supply chain for the most part. And so some of our key suppliers, we're trying to have them invest or produce here in the U.S. LG Chemical, which is our cathode supplier, they're building a plant in Tennessee to do cathode materials. And that's the first cathode material plant here in North America. So we're clearly pushing our suppliers to localize. However, there are some limits to that, right? There's some components that are going to be very difficult to localize in a short term. And, this is where I think you need a nuanced tariff regime, because if you want a healthy auto industry and if you want a healthy battery industry, you need to be able to source raw materials in a competitive way, right? So that you can have a competitive industry. And if you restrict the content coming in too severely, then right, you can't have a competitive battery industry or competitive auto industry, and so you're hurting the industries that you're trying to support in the first place. So I think that's where we're having a lot of discussions on, what to localize when, and we're obviously also meeting with government officials and administration officials as well to try to explain, what is a reasonable path to diversify away from, especially China and other regions where, we want to be less dependent. So that supply chain is a really complex one. While we've done more than most battery makers, I think we're less dependent on Chinese suppliers, whether it's equipment or raw materials. There's still some materials where there's no other supplier. And so, that's the part that will have the biggest impact for us in the short run.
Yeah, that was a great breakdown that really shows how many prongs there are to this. Can you talk more about the parts or the materials that you can't find in the US today? What are some of those? And, as a follow-up to that, I know that China has restricted rare earth minerals to the US. How does that impact the business?
So, the biggest raw material component that has high dependency on China is anode materials. So most of the graphite that's used for anode materials are currently being processed in China. And while we're trying to diversify, that's the one that's taking the longest. This is really an issue of energy usage. In order to make anode materials, you're taking, graphite and then you're cooking it at very high temperature for upwards of a week to transform the chemistry. So it's a very, very energy intensive process. And in China, they have subsidized heavily, and so they've lowered the cost for those anode materials, and that's why they have a dominant supply of it. So I think we have to understand where it makes sense to provide anode material or produce anode materials. Has to be a location where I think there's a energy cost advantage, because it's really all about heating and baking. It's not really the difficulty in technology, but just the amount of energy that's required. And we just haven't built that value chain here in North America. So that's the one that's the most critical out of all the different components. And then I would say, in general, as we move from NMC chemistry to LFP chemistry, on the NMC side, we're almost entirely not dependent on Chinese suppliers. We have, mostly suppliers from Korea or Japan, or in some cases Europe. And, we're a market leader in NMC, and, we've developed these suppliers going back decades. So we have a very resilient position, anode and graphite excluded, right? So that's an area that we feel very comfortable with. I think as we move toward LFP traditionally have been more dominated by Chinese battery players. And so the supply chain also happens to be largely dominated by Chinese suppliers as well. And we're having to work with them to produce these, LFP battery cells in the US. Really critical for energy storage, grid storage, and it's a national security issue. And, as I said, we're committed to building these products here in the US, but we do need some time to diversify away from some of those suppliers. And we're pushing very hard on companies like LNF, LG Chemical, POSCO, our partners who do CAM materials, so that they can catch up and be a good supplier to us. And so there's really aggressive activity, but these are things that just doesn't happen overnight.
Sure. And you mentioned some have already started. LG Chemical, I know POSCO is here as well. Yes. So your footprint in North America, 8 plants across North America, 7 in the US, 1 you mentioned in Canada with Stellantis. How do the tariffs affect that plant, that Canadian plant with Stellantis? Are the batteries that you make there mostly for the Canadian market anyway, or will you have to ship those to the US and pay a tariff?
So, part of that is dependent on Stellantis production strategy, right? Where they choose to produce what vehicles. So, obviously, because it is not in the US, there's some additional risks with having a plant in Canada. And we're really trying to monitor, the automotive tariffs. But also, I think there is a successor to USMCA that will be discussed with Canada. And we don't know exactly how that's going to look. But obviously, depending on, how that gets adjusted, it will have a, significant impact on that plant. So I think this is really a discussion about Canadian auto industry overall, right? Because we have a battery plant there, but a number of our customers have plants there. And most of those products are for export into the US. And so I think this discussion between US and Canada will have a significant impact. And so while tariff has those cost and other risk elements across all of our plants, our Nexstar plant has this additional uncertainty regarding the relationship with Canada. And so I can't tell you exactly where things will fall, but I can tell you that we are having lots of scenario planning and discussions, weekly discussions, task force with our customer, just to understand exactly how we're going to, move forward with that plant. But we're, certainly looking at opportunities, outside of the U.S. for that plant and other applications as, scenario planning. But it's a little early for us to pull the trigger on doing something drastically different. I think we're cautiously optimistic that we'll have a, positive result with Canada, and then that plant will be, viable. So, that is the plant that I think, has the largest number of uncertainties among our network.
Bob Lee is North American president of LG Energy Solution. You can hear his full conversation with our own Hannah Lutz on Shift, a podcast about mobility. That's available now wherever you get your podcasts. That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Jamie Butters.
And I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to Automotive News executive producer Jake Neer, as well as our own Mary Corey, David Phillips, Hans Grimo, Nato Akamura, and Carly Schaffner for their reporting for today's podcast. You can get the latest news on tech and innovation, electrification, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com.
Come back tomorrow for a conversation with experts about the latest twists and turns in U.S. trade policy and what they mean for the supply chain.
What is the art of the possible? What are supply chains we ought to focus on? And are there supply chains that probably are not coming back to the United States? And that's a valid question.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoy the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.